Okay, good. Thanks for everyone speaking. We have some time for questions. I mean, I just want to say also how happy I am to see this growing collaboration and cooperation. I think there's an initial response to think of these things as competitors and this sort of zero-sum game and winners and losers and to pick your favorite sports team. And it just, we're all the same. We all have the same goals. We want information out there and finding ways to work together and to not be redundant and spend twice on the same thing and to work together, I think, is really important. I'm very pleased to see more and more of this sort of cooperation going on. Questions? Start over here.
As a question for Mark, the way you gathered the research information, I took it, there was a pull-down menu that lists all these funding agencies. And my question has to do with the fact that some of the research funders we're seeing are local. They could be corporate, they could be state, they could be university money. And an author might be tempted to list all of those things when being asked to put in all this information. And so it's probably beyond the scope of what you're doing, but what are you going to do when an author wants to add all of that? Is there a free text field where they can put in everything?
Right.
The publisher might want to flag.
So I think both Howard and I showed sort of screen snippets of the standard entry screens that some of the managed contracting systems. As I said, APS ourselves, we aren't doing that, but there is a way for if they want to add something that's not in the registry, there is a way in all of these systems to do that and indicate this is a new entry. And one of the outstanding problems, which I didn't really talk about, I think Chuck raising his hand over there, but one of the big things is with Crossref is, so we can deposit that information even if it doesn't have an identifier in the FundRef registry, so into Crossref, and then there is a process where I mentioned that Elsevier and Crossref are working together to maintain the registry. So those entries that don't get identifiers are actually pulled into the system. They're vetted into the process, and they're vetted. And then if they decide to add a identifier back, then they will push that information back to Crossref. And then what's still remaining is how to push that information back to publishers so that we know, okay, this got an ID or this didn't get an ID. Crossref will not, as far as I know, update the metadata on behalf of the publisher. And so there's a whole bunch of, but this is all, the FundRef working group is still working through all of these issues. So, and as far as like at what granularity, I mean, again, it's going to be, I think, a learning experience for everybody to sort of figure out what instructions to give authors. I mean, it's very easy if we were just doing chorus with the U.S. agencies to say, make sure you put in all your federal funders. But if we're really going out beyond that, we need to do that. And it's probably highly field and highly journal dependent too.
Yeah.
Mark, there is an API already at FundRef and Crossref to discover what changes may have happened since you deposited a DOI with funder information. And you'll be given back a suggested set of information that identifies what identifiers might be appropriate for the funder that had been the funding name that had been provided. So that is available right now. Find out about it at help.crossref.org.
Oh, good. I wasn't sure the API was up there. Yeah.
Okay.
We're not doing the notification yet. Send that publisher a notification that says information that impacts your deposit with FundRef has changed to something. Right now, it is required to hold that.
Okay, here in the middle. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, related to that, how is how is Chorus going to deal with authors who do not include all of their funding grants that they have, but then later when they go to do their grant renewal, then they list those papers, and then the funding agency wants the paper to fund. How do you deal with getting those things?
So that's a good question. Actually, I probably should have put that under other considerations. I think, I talked about how we're looking at submission time or at proof time, getting that information, and again, educating authors that your acknowledgements need to be complete in this area, avoid abbreviations, and be specific and things like that. But inevitably they will make a mistake or something. And so, so one thing is, if you're embedding that into your JATS XML, that's, your version of record XML, I think we've already decided that we need another way to store additional information that will be updates, and then you need a process to be able to take those updates and then push that back out to Crossref. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to the grantee's responsibility for fulfilling the requirements of their funding agencies, and publishers can only do as well as the information that we're given.
Right, but it's still on the publisher. If we have an agreement, like, as an example, if we have an agreement with PMC that we will provide the information and the author do not give us the correct funding information, once they've given that manuscript information to the grant agency,
Right.
then it comes back on us to supply the information to PMC. So if in theory, this is an alternative to using PMC, there needs to be some kind of a mechanism to facilitate that.
Yeah, so first off, I want to say that Crossref does allow you to update records after you've made your initial deposit. So one of the mechanisms that we're trying to figure out is, how do publishers want to actually do this? But the Crossref system itself allows that to happen. Chuck, I'm looking into you. Yeah, he's saying yes. So there you go. Right. Free of charge to do these updates. So says Chuck. So there you go. And the actual methodology, basically the way I've started to hear it from most of my publisher pilot people is that whomever is doing that initial deposit, so whether or not that's a publisher themselves or whether or not it's a hosting agency, so it could be the Silverchairs, the Adapons, the Semanticos, they can then enable that for you. And so that they can redeposit that DOI with that additional metadata, and then therefore you're being compliant.
Yeah, Richard, in the back?
I was actually going to ask the same question, that's specific directly to Mark. So given that you're having to find this information in the acknowledgements, then it therefore becomes data rather than metadata. So if you change it, you're going to issue an error after every time you get it wrong.
Well, I'll tell you, we already treat acknowledgements as something where we have something called publisher's notes, where important metadata, an author name was misspelled, you really want to correct that in the version of record, not just make a note about it, but actually change it. So we have a mechanism for doing that, and we will do that for acknowledgement sections. It's part of our editorial practices. Where if somebody writes in and says, oh, I forgot to acknowledge this, or I got this grant number wrong, we will do that. We get very few of those, but I think that will become a more prevalent kind of a thing. And so we can push that stuff through into the version of record, or, like I said, we may need, it might be years later, and then it's not clear. We just want to make sure the metadata that we're registering in Crossref is, and in our systems is complete. So we haven't tackled that yet because we haven't needed to, but it's an important issue to keep on the radar.
Yeah, I think we've seen, as the NIH started to really enforce their, in the past they haven't really pushed really hard and enforced PubMed Central depositing, which in the last year or two they really started, and so we've had a good number of authors sort of come up with, my grant is, I need to get it renewed, and I should have deposited, but it wasn't, sort of things like that, and I think we do go out of our way to set up these manual ways to do that. I think that's, there are important lessons that we're learning from that, that I think can be applied to any system that gets built, just to, because the whole point is you want your authors to keep their grant money, and you need to do everything possible to do that, so.
There's a small murmur out there right now about separating out this funder information from the acknowledgements as well. So this is an evolving landscape, and the important thing is for you all to be involved in that discussion so we can evolve together and develop standards and practices that we can all follow together rather than everyone doing their own thing. That will only drive everyone crazy.
Yeah, and I think that's a really key point here, is to think in terms of standards, in terms of automation. I mean, the less of a burden we can put on our authors, the more compliance we're going to see. And I think, the more we can have standards that are regularly followed, the more sort of automation we can build into the system. You want to start here?
I have a question for Michael. You were talking about going through a harmonization process with all of the agencies. I'm just wondering if you can talk about that a bit more. Because I just see while these services are being developed, if we got 21, 25 agencies doing their own thing, I'm working at a project where we're trying to help those with AI policy. And that just kind of, like red lights are going on, what's going on, all of these different institutions doing their own thing.
Indeed. So, the harmonization is happening across the different parts of the policy. So for example, on one of the requirements of the policy is that all the agencies develop a mechanism for receiving petitions or requests for changing the embargo period. It's a very simple idea that there should be a front door that people come in through. I am using the microphone. I guess it's not on.
No, I think it's on. Just get a little closer.
Okay. Better. So, there we go. So so in that particular case, it doesn't make any sense, for example, to have two agencies that fund the same field of research to have two different embargo periods. And so one of the things that we would be harmonizing is ensuring that if one of them decides that they would like to shift the embargo period, that they are required to work together and have the same one. So this is something that, so automatically when you petition one agency for changing the embargo period, they would necessarily have to work with other agencies that fund research in that field. That's an example of the type of harmonization that's happening, but it's happening across the entirety of the policy. One of the requirements of the policy was that agencies look to use existing archives and databases where possible. And so some agencies already had existing publication archives that they'll be using for their policies. But if someone has funding, one of the things that we haven't really figured out well yet is that if someone has funding from agency A and B that contributed to a particular publication, will they have to deposit in two different repositories? In that particular case, we're going to try and solve that so that there's some crosstalk, but it isn't resolved quite yet because not all of the different databases are built. So that may not be reflected in their plans, but it's certainly reflected in what they intend to do once we can figure out which databases different agencies will be using. So that's sort of the two examples of the harmonization that we're talking about. So there's certainly a desire to make it so for folks like yourself and for researchers that this is a simple to implement policy, but there's going to be bumps in the road for sure when you're increasing. We've never done anything like this kind of expansion, so this is there'll be lots of bumps.
Yeah. I mean, we're officially at the end of our time, but I think everybody's willing to hang out and continue the discussion. So if you want to go to the break, go to the break. If you want to keep asking questions, let's keep going.
I'm from the Ecological Society of America, and regardless of agency mandates, we decided for the betterment of science that we should institute mandates for data archiving in conjunction with publication. But we also realized that no one wanted to be the first journal to do this, the only journal doing it. So we had a society summit of the leading journals in evolutionary biology and ecology, and agreed that all 12 of us would work to implement kind of joint features, and this was in conjunction with Dryad's establishment and some generous funding from NSF. That funding to start up Dryad has dried up, and now we are in the position of having to tell authors who don't have funding for archiving of data that they're going to have to cough up. It's a small fee right now, but it is a fee that they're balking at, and I'm just wondering why the government didn't tie some of these requirements to the establishment of a data archive similar to GenBank for genetic data.
That's exactly the sort of things that we're trying to figure out as well. But I don't think there'll be one business model for archiving. That doesn't, I don't think that makes sense. This is something that we're going to have to evolve to, though. Someone's going to have to pay for data deposition.
Right. And
Absolutely.
We allow people to, I mean.
In this case,
authors
likely the funders, yeah.
In Oak Ridge National Lab has a really good archive. There are others
Yeah.
that are available to some of our authors. We think that libraries play a role in establishing more institutional archives for data.
I was literally having a conversation about this sort of issue yesterday. How do we actually set up long-term funding for these sorts of things as well, so we're also not at the whim of Congress? And so there are some ideas on this as well. A couple of them are things that have never been tried before. So this is an active part of the conversation.
This is very much something that we're
Yeah.
facing because a lot of our research community is based in small colleges and they
Right.
don't have access to data archives. But we
Great.
do now have a requirement for 2 of our journals that they need to agree to archive their data. And
2 or 12? I thought you said 12.
12 society publishers agreed
Right.
to implement
Right.
this. Ours was the biggest society, but we have only implemented the requirement for 2 of our 6 journals.
Okay. Can I have your card afterwards? Thank you.
All right, we got time for everybody. We'll start up in the front and work our way through.
Hi, I work for a manuscript tracking system, Aries Systems, and we're being asked to pass along the embargo period as part of the metadata. But so I just learned today that I guess the agencies haven't finally settled on what their final embargo period is going to be. When they do, is that going to be someplace where we can access it? I understand it's not going into FundRec. I don't know if Chuck is still there, but so where would we be able to pick up that information?
That'll be in all of the agency plans as they're rolled out.
But is that going to be electronically somewhere that we can access it?
Yes.
Howard, do you want to?
Yeah, so once the agency plans are known, it's one of the features that Chorus will be offering. I'd like to talk to you more because I'm not sure where you're planning on depositing that. However, the embargo does pass into the license information, so that's what's held within Crossref, which is what we've talked about before. But one of the plans, as soon as the agency plans are known, is that Chorus would keep track of all this information and supply it to our various different members.
Who wants to go next?
Just a quick follow-on.
Yeah.
So are you saying that's going to be associated with the Thunder ID?
Yes.
So it'll be in the RDF file that's downloaded from FundRec?
Not sure yet until we get.
Because I talked to Chris Bennings. and I
Yeah,
don't
we're
know
not
if
sure whether or not
that's-
it's going to be passed exactly through Crossref or going to exist as a Chorus service. So we do have our own
Okay,
service.
so using the FundRec ID?
Yeah, it'll be tied to the ID in some way, whether or not Crossref holds it or whether or not we hold it. That'll be
To clarify that, right now, the license reference information that's deposited applies to the article as a whole. And what that does is you specify, this is the license that's applicable for this period of time. You need to have expiration type, so if there's an embargo period, you would say, there's one license that's appropriate for today or 9 months. Then you would say, this is the license that kicks in on such and such a date, 9 months in the future. That applies to the article as a whole, not to any specific one.
Did you want to?
Yeah, I was curious, given some of the issues that have been raised about correctly identifying the agency name or sub-agency name as Murata and so on, are there any plans on the part of the government agencies to make that information available themselves? Publishers to extract that from acknowledgement paragraphs that may be incorrect, and even down to the grant number or award number that right now there's no way to validate. It seems like the agencies hold out all that information somewhere. Will that be made accessible somewhere?
Yeah, it depends on the agency. Some agencies will, it doesn't make sense to set up entire systems for doing it for some agencies. So for example, the USAID, for example, is, even though they have over $100 million in R&D dollars that come out every year, there's probably less than 100 research papers that come out each year. But some of the larger agencies are considering how to do that. Participating, obviously, in FundRef is one way to do that. But yeah, scientists make mistakes in their manuscripts pretty much every time. Yeah.
All right, let's keep going back.
Yes, can any of you speak to the possible implications of state level OA limits? Last time I checked, there were 3 states California, New York, Illinois, I believe, that had introduced legislation. I don't think any of those passed, but I'm wondering where that goes.
The only comment I'll say is that Chorus is not focused on that at the moment, but as far as state level as well as other international mandates, we are listening and observing, and as they pass, well, obviously we'll have to address them.
Yeah, no, I think Chorus, is built to be scalable on a set of standards. So, the real focus is meeting these federal U.S. government requirements, but, once that's good, it's a system that could be expandable. And SHARE also is not, my understanding of SHARE is it's not just focused on this set of requirements. SHARE is meant to be international. It is meant to be a broad approach that can address many of these different requirements.
I'll just add also that the current FundRef registry already has some of the state level funding agencies in there. So if you're capturing that information and depositing Crossref, should that become available as a mandate or a requirement, then that metadata would already be there in order to build on it.
Wayne, did you want to?
Could you say something about sustainability policy?